A while back, I was curious and I wondered, what are the rules of podcasting? Does a podcast have to fit a certain format in order to be considered a podcast? Could it be a comedy skit? Could it be scripted? Does it need to have a co-host? I asked online and I was pleasantly surprised when the overwhelming response was, it can be whatever you want it to be. That was exactly the answer that I was hoping for.
The Great Big Intergalactic.
I get bored of things easy, so when I launched the Great Big Intergalactic, this podcast, I didn't want to limit myself to a specific format or theme, which I had done in the past on my previous podcast. I wanted the freedom to talk about something as random as vuvuzelas one week and then armadillos the next. This is part 2 of how to start a podcast. If you haven't listened to episode 1, my main guest's name is Derrick, and he owns Hindsight 101 Media, which can be found at hindsight101media.com. He's the guy who taught me about podcasting, and I'll be asking him some questions that will hopefully help any new podcasters out there to navigate the process of starting out your new podcast for the first time. Once again, though, like we did in the first episode, before we get to the questions with Derrick, I had asked a few people who had already launched their podcast to talk about why they felt so driven to create a podcast of their own and how they went about it. And here's another response that I received.
Hello. My name is Lance Ingram, and I'm the host of Yesterday's Concert, a live music podcast that immerses you into a concert odyssey. Podcasting for me is a way to connect to other music lovers out there. I've been to more than 750 concerts in the last 15 years, so this show gives me a way to share those experiences with the greater music fandom. Everyone has a memory of seeing their favorite band for the first time, and my hope is others are able to connect in those shared experiences. I began working on my podcast about 4 years before I launched the first episode. It started as a little bit different project before I pivoted into making it into a podcast. In retrospect, I wish I had started it earlier. So that's my biggest piece of advice. Don't wait. Get going. As for gear, right now I'm using a Yeti Blue 10 microphone and running it through GarageBand. That program works best for the production I do on my show. If I were a show that was a little more straightforward, I'd probably use Audacity as it's another great software, and it's free. Thanks for letting me share, and best of luck in your new endeavors.
Thank you, Lance. I really enjoyed listening to Lance's podcast. I'm a big fan of music, and once again, the audio quality is really great, and the stories he tells are pretty compelling. I wasn't actually sure how he was going to turn the experience of sitting in an audience into this great story, but he did it. I listened to the Pearl Jam episode first, and the only problem was that I kept pausing the show because it was so compelling that it just made me want to listen to Pearl Jam. So I turned it off and listened to Pearl Jam for a while, and then I kept coming back to the podcast and eventually made it to the end of the show. But let's get to the questions with my guest. I asked Derrick from Hindsight 101 Media, when starting out a podcast, how would someone decide if they need to have a co-host for their show or if they should just go solo?
So I struggled a lot with deciding whether or not I wanted to have a co-host or not. And I suggest that people practice. So just make like 5 or 6 episodes that you're just going to junk. I know it sounds pointless and a waste of time, but you'll learn a lot, especially when you listen to yourself the first time. And those first couple of times, it could be a little cringy to hear yourself because you don't really listen to yourself a lot. I'm so used to it now that it doesn't bother me anymore. But I knew in the beginning, like, I really sound like that. It was crazy. And, I would put more bass in my voice because I felt like I sounded like a squeaky doll, but, whatever. But I would say just do some pre-recordings of yourself and then maybe do one with a guest or a co-host, and just a family member. It doesn't have to be like some real big deal, but just kind of practice what you think is comfortable for you. But no, it all depends on your workflow and your style. Like I said, I'm a horrible speaker, but I'm boring by myself. But if I have someone to feed off of, that worked out really well. And then you can have multiple. I know a lot of podcasts that have like 4, 5, 6 people. It's just, you really have to be careful when you start adding more people. There's just a lot more work involved as far as equipment, cost, editing, because you usually want to edit different tracks. That helps out a lot, especially when people talk over each other, or one person has some sound in the background. If you have one recording of everybody, it's hard to remove background noise from different microphones or different places like that, especially if you're doing remote podcasting. Since the pandemic, my co-host and I, we've done remote probably for the last year, and I think we might continue that. And we record separate tracks. So if his air conditioner goes off, I just have to take that out of his track, but my track is fine. Whereas if we mesh those two together, it would be harder to take out the air conditioner from his track, but not affect my voice. So yeah, it's different. But yes, totally up to you how many people you want to use. Just know that the more people, the cost goes up, and also the post-production work goes up as well. But there's no hard line. You could have 20 people if you think you can manage that. I mean, it would be a nightmare, but if you think you can do it, go right ahead.
How many microphones do you need for a podcast?
I would say a good rule of thumb is one microphone per person. I know there's some podcasts out there that'll take there's a certain type of microphone that you can use, and then they'll have like 4 people huddled around one microphone. I think that is horrible, horrible, horrible. Do not do it. It sounds terrible. It's a nightmare to edit. You need to have separate microphones and separate tracks. And what I mean by separate tracks, as I mentioned before, is a lot of times some people will record all 5 people onto one track. So it's hard to edit or change things when you have everyone on one track. But if you have individual tracks, individual recordings of each person, then that makes it so much easier. There's a little more work involved and takes up a little more hard drive space, but you will thank yourself later by doing individual tracks than putting it all together. You can try putting it all together, and if you like it, go ahead. But for me, I love individual tracks. As you get better, and then if your co-host or whatever gets better at it, then I would think about maybe meshing it all together. But in the beginning, separate tracks are more forgiving for mistakes or issues. And then like I said, microphones, it's really personal preference and based off your environment, whether or not you get a dynamic microphone or a condenser microphone. Like I said, more podcasters use dynamic microphones because it picks up less background noise. But you can use a condenser microphone. You just have to be in a good environment that has very little reverb and background noise. And then what microphone should you get? That is definitely personal preference, because microphones will make your voice sound different. And then the same microphone for my voice will sound different on your voice when you're talking. So you really have to kind of play around with them. I know it's really hard to buy these really expensive microphones. So I would say, start on the low end. You can get some really good microphones for an inexpensive price. I know for when I kind of do my traveling podcast, I have these $35 microphones. You do have to have some additional equipment like a recorder or something like that in order to do it, and some cables and blah, blah, blah. But it's very inexpensive because I have all the other stuff. Buying those microphones were very inexpensive. But then I also have $400 microphones that I record on because I like the way it sounds. Or you can get a USB microphone. Then that really just plug and play into your computer or your iPad. You don't really need a lot of extra equipment. Like I said, like a cable, audio interface, stuff like that, where a audio interface or recorder, you really just need your microphone, a USB cable, and a laptop or tablet to plug it into. So it really just depends on your setup, your preference, your budget, a lot of things. So at that point, if you're unsure, I would reach out to somebody, or you can do a lot of research on YouTube, Google it. There's plenty of information now than I'd probably say maybe 5-6 so years ago. So it's if you're willing to do a little research, you can find anything you want, or you reach out to me if you'd like.
Should a podcast be scripted? Should it be like a live conversation? Should we have outlines?
I know for myself, if I was a solo podcaster, I would have to have it scripted because I am a horrible speaker. I won't lie. So when I've tried to do solo podcasts, and without that interaction with somebody else, I am so dry and boring. So I would have to have something scripted that I follow, and I wouldn't have to have something just off the cuff because it would just be horrendous. Now, with my podcast that I do that I have a co-host, we don't script it, but we have an outline. So we know what topics we're going to hit, but all the in-between stuff is kind of just off the cuff. And that works really well. But it really just works off your preference. I would say at least have an outline of what you're going to talk about, so you kind of have a flow. But I don't think you have to have it word from word. Some people do, but you don't have to have it word from word. And then there is no real format that you have to follow. I would consider the storytelling format and not like jump all over the place, or keep a consistent format so people know what to expect every time they tune into your episodes. But I don't think if you do it this way or that way, it's going to change anything, or you're not considered a podcast anymore. Podcasting in that definition is very broad. So some people might call it radio, or some people might call it podcasting. I really don't see a whole lot of difference. I know there's certain like technical differences, but really now that, a lot of radio stations are online, I just call it like it's internet radio. That's kind of how I describe a podcast, even though there is internet radio. But yeah, there's a lot of overlap and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of blurring.
What do you think makes a good podcast?
What makes a good podcast is pretty subjective. For me, I would probably say with your storytelling skills, your topic, your speaking skills, your editing skills, all that really comes into play. And I think in the beginning, you're really just trying to hone those skills. And like I said, that's your time to experiment with things. You might start on one topic, change it. You might start on a certain length and change it. Just a lot of different things. You'll notice a lot of your ticks, like your likes, some of the stuff that I do, I still am working on. But all those things in the beginning, you'll want to work on, because, no one's really listening. And then as you get discovered, hopefully you improve over time and get better. And then people will want to listen more and be more involved and be more engaged.
There's a lot to consider when starting out a podcast. My previous show was about an hour and a half long per episode, and I also had a co-host where we interviewed guests in person. My co-host for that show was great, and we'd still be doing shows together if not for COVID restrictions killing the show a couple years back. But all of the other things about the old format, I decided to change it up, to adjust it to better fit my personality, since I was now forced to go solo. I changed things to better match my strengths and weaknesses, both of which I'd learned about extremely quickly in the early days of the first show. I remember in the initial moments of our first practice podcast episode, my co-host went off on a tangent, and when he was done, I was like, what should I say next? He'd completely gone off the script, and I had no idea what to do with the direction that he had taken things. It wasn't where I expected the conversation to go, and it took us several episodes to realize that he needed to be the main guy in live situations like that, and I was better off just kind of interjecting here and there. So when COVID forced me to go solo, I knew that my podcast was going to have to be very different, scripted, and highly edited. As long as that old show was, I was obsessed with editing it, like to an unhealthy point. I probably easily spent at least 8 hours on editing the average show because of my obsession with trying to make it perfect. So I knew that when I started the Great Big Intergalactic, it would need to be much, much shorter in order to cut down on editing time and for me to maintain my sanity. The old show was on a schedule every other week. So between editing and coming up with content, I got burnt out very quickly. Because of that, my new podcast isn't on a schedule. A new episode comes out whenever I have something I believe is worth sharing. I have at least a dozen half-written episode scripts for this program that I have never recorded because, honestly, in their current state, they just weren't good enough to share. I'd like to create content that I could be proud of, rather than to release crappy content due to this feeling that I need to push it out on a set schedule. I'd rather give my audience quality over quantity. Whether I've done that or not, that's subjective. But the point of me talking about all of this is that it took me a while to really understand what my strengths and weaknesses were and how I needed to adjust accordingly. I've always said that if you want to know what people think of you, record yourself for a while and force yourself to watch it or listen. I am so much more self-aware of my quirks than I was 3 years ago when I first started podcasting. I've come to the conclusion that to know what kind of format you would be best suited for when creating a podcast, you have to think about what your strengths and weaknesses are and go from there. Are you a good speaker? Do you need editing to be interesting, like I do? Do you need a script or an outline to be compelling? Or are you more like my former co-host who can just be completely interesting while speaking for an hour, but probably needs someone else to help navigate him through the conversation? I personally think that Derrick's suggestion about creating a few episodes that nobody will ever hear is a really great idea. There's a radio talk show host that I listen to from time to time, and one day on the show he was asked by a listener, "How do I know if I have what it takes to be a talk show host myself?" And his answer was, "Can you sit in front of a microphone and be interesting for 3 hours straight?" It was something that I tried. It was a fascinating exercise for me personally, and I sat down and I tried to talk for really just 5 minutes at a time, and the overwhelming answer was no. I couldn't be a radio talk show host, not a live one. I can't be compelling for 3 hours. Fortunately for me, though, it's the year 2022, and with the help of modern technology, I can edit out all of the things that would make me an otherwise horrible radio host. Enough about my shortcomings, though. There will be at least a couple of other episodes for this series, and I'll have Derrick back to answer some more questions. So I hope you'll join us again to learn more about what it takes to start a podcast. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Big Intergalactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com, TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic, or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200-7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.